Professor Nalapat, why is India so eager to join the nuclear suppliers group? What exactly is at stake?
Well, the fact is that India has a very substantial nuclear industry. It has built up this industry over the last 50 years, and it's entirely built up by its own industry and by its own scientific pool. So I think India has got a lot to contribute to the world in terms of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, for example, or the peaceful use of the atom. Now, by being a member of the NSG, India will be enabled to be on the same platform as other major powers, and as a consequence there will be far more interaction between India and other major powers, including the US and China.
I see. Mr. Smith, since President Obama already calling Prime Minister Modi as a partner and friend, Prime Minister Modi calling Mr. Obama a friend, can US using its swaying power to convince India to join non-proliferation treaty and therefore make India eligible to join the NSG eventually?
Well, I think America and President Obama has taken a different approach, and what the United States has been trying to do is to carve out an exemption for India to join the nuclear suppliers group without joining the non-proliferation treaty. That is not a necessary prerequisite to join the NSG. There have been members in the past, non-NPT members, who have joined the NSG, and I think the United States is making the case that India's non-proliferation record is quite exemplary compared to perhaps some others in the region. And in fact, many countries agree with the United States that India meets the requirements set forth by the NSG, although, as you mentioned, there is still some disagreement, and I know that Beijing feels differently.
Well, I guess Beijing does feel differently. So are some of the other countries who are already members of the NSG. Just to explain to our viewers what NSG is about. It's a specific organization made up of 48 members. Every one of them claims that they are going to use the nuclear reactors and also the nuclear energy in a peaceful way, not diverting them to any other kinds of usage. After saying this, let me come to you, Ms. Lee. Would the United States' efforts of making an exception for India necessarily going to be the role that other countries can also tread in the future when they want to join NSG? And will NSG still be NSG if that is the case?
Yeah, so I think that's why, that's what the Chinese concern is about, you know, because at the moment, according to my understanding, every, member in the NSG now have already signed the NPT. Yeah, so from the Chinese side, actually, China does not, is not against the peaceful use, the right of peaceful use of the nuclear energy from the Indian side. The problem, I think, is about the credibility of this, non-proliferation regime.
For example, Professor Modi, the people could argue, if India does that, why can't Pakistan? Or some of the other countries in the regions and beyond. Professor Modi, very briefly from you. Will the friendship with Washington really carry things forward?
Well, I'm really optimistic that India will be joining the NSG. We have found that after, for example, the US and India nuclear agreement, China was initially hesitant, but subsequently supported India. Now, China is our most important neighbor, and China and India are the two largest developing countries in the world. And let's be honest, I don't think there's any comparison between India and any other country in the region. So I'm sure the Chinese appreciate that, like themselves, India is a major power and should be looked at as a separate entity from other countries in the region or outside. The United States has made that determination, and we in India expect our friends in Beijing to make the same determination.
Very interesting you mentioned about the role of China in its relations with India and also India's overall international role as a result. Mr. Smith, this is an interesting argument, isn't it? I mean, this time you see the U.S. strong interest into developing a stronger ties with India than it used to be. Many suggest it has a lot to do with the U.S. Policies of so-called rebalancing in Asia. Many believe here in this part of the world that it has a lot to do with the U.S. Image about China and U.S. future strategies against China. So can India, from your perspective, balance itself very well between Washington and Beijing?
Well, I think the U.S.-India embrace dates back much farther than the U.S. pivot to Asia. It really was in the early 2000s under the Bush administration, after the 9/11 terror attacks, that the U.S. and India began to consummate this strategic partnership, and it has advanced continuously since then. I think there's no question that some shared concerns about Chinese behavior is a motivating factor in the U.S.-India relationship, but so are some shared concerns about Pakistan's behavior, frankly. There's a wide array of factors underpinning U.S.-India relations, and I think both sides have made it clear on many occasions that in no way is the relationship designed to contain China or be offensive to Beijing.
Right. When it comes to international relations, it's all about national interests, isn't it? But let's go through some of these important national interest points, for example, between New Delhi and Washington. Ms. Li, first of all, China's role. Earlier, we heard already very clearly coming from Mr. Smith, the analysis of it. But two things, at least the media reports are suggesting, bringing New Delhi and Washington ever closer. One is China's submarine so-called patrol in the Bay of Bengal, and many believe that motivated India to get ever closer military relations with Washington. Secondly is the still existing territorial disputes between China and India, and therefore which brings New Delhi ever closer to Washington again. So how, from China's perspective, see these two so-called reasonings? And what would that mean for Beijing?
Yeah, actually, in my understanding, there's no problem for China that U.S. and India they get closer to each other. I think as India is an emerging power, which nobody can overlook it, today. So it's natural for U.S. to go close to India, and also, U.S. is the leading power in the world nowadays. Still is the leading power. So I think it's very natural for India and U.S. to go close. But in terms of the security issue, because as you know, for the rebalance power, the U.S. official make it very clear they want India to be the linchpin of that rebalance. And also, several 2 months back, the U.S. Defense Secretary said that they want to have India to join U.S. to make a joint patrol in the South China Sea. This, I think, will make the situation very complicated.
Well, will that make you feel complicated, Professor Nalapat? What about that? We understand, just adding to what Ms. Li here said, U.S. and India signed several different levels of agreements concerning military exchanges, including the U.S. use of the Indian bases and also refueling and many other issues. Of course, that caused interest coming from Beijing and many others here in Asia, Pakistan included. So what exactly is New Delhi having in mind?
Well, I'd like to point out that those in India or those in the United States for that matter who are talking of a war with China, they're probably only in mental asylums. No sane person is going to talk in China, India or the United States of a war between these countries. I don't think it's going to ever happen, because the relationship between China and the United States, for example, is much closer than the relationship between India and the US. The point is that we have been afflicted with Wahhabi terror, and so has the United States, so has the global community. And India has built up several strengths in the military field in confronting this kind of terror. India has built up a very good naval capacity. So from all these points of view, the two defense establishments are coming together. And I think this is an inevitable process that's going to take place over the next 3 or 4 years, irrespective of who's in power in Washington. Because after all, the threats that India faces are the same as the threats that the US faces.
Mr. Smith, what do you think? 'Cause sometimes these kinds of ever closer relationship could bear some wonderful results, but other time it could unnecessarily or sometimes necessarily alarm the third party. This time China probably is involved.
Well, as I said, the two sides have on many cases reiterated that the relationship is not directed at China. And Beijing has itself reiterated on several occasions that it sees no problem with U.S.-India strengthening partnership. I think some of India's growing concerns, as you mentioned before, do relate to the presence now of the Chinese Navy, the People's Liberation Army Navy, its growing profile in the Indian Ocean. China has much more robust relationship now with many of India's neighbors, including Sri Lanka and Nepal, and certainly its long-standing relationship with Pakistan. In some cases, this is an instance of growing spheres of influence of two rising powers that's creating some natural friction. Thus far, I think they've done a pretty admirable job in managing those tensions, but I don't think it's any surprise to see the United States and India coming closer together, nor is it necessary that that partnership be directed against China if we can address some of the more fundamental security concerns that all three capitals have.
All right. Will that be secure for China or more concerns from China, Ms. Lee?
Yeah, I think the point here is the transparency. I mean, because at the moment, we have to say that there's a mistrust between China and the U.S. and also a mistrust between China and India because of border dispute. So I think when India and U.S. get together, especially under the background of that rebalance strategy, I think both U.S. and India should make it more transparent, because today I read a report about a kind of action plan in the Asia Pacific. So, but the report said it will not make it public. So I think for China, we will think about what kind of action plan it will.
All right,
be.
Very interesting over there. Not only about the strategic issues, but also about some very specific issues. For example, trade. U.S. and India's trade relations is getting ever closer. U.S. is one of India's largest trading partner. In 2006, U.S. exported $9.7 billion worth of goods to India and imported about $21.8 billion worth of Indian goods. A decade later, now we're having these figures more than doubled already. American imports, though, from India amounted to 2% of its overall imports and 15.3% of India's overall exports in 2015, though that's the number over there. Of course, the bilateral trade exploded, but more than the bilateral trade, we are seeing the climate change issue, also a big one, Mr. Smith. President Obama, of course, considering his legacy, one of them is a climate change issue, Paris Accord, of course. But that would not be implemented until those countries who are emitting about 55% of the overall world's emissions are committed to this. And will Prime Minister Modi's visit this time really bring the good news, and the final good news in the near future?
Well, I'm sure President Obama is hoping so, and there certainly has been some movement on the climate change issue during Prime Minister Modi's visit. But frankly, that is one of among 24 very important topics that have been covered since Prime Minister Modi has been here. Economics, as you mentioned, is certainly one of them, but it expands far beyond that to information exchange sharing agreements on aircraft carrier technology, to India's designation as a major defense partner, to the logistics exchange memorandum. Frankly, the joint statement between the two countries was many, many pages and many paragraphs
Right.
long, and I think a demonstration of the breadth of cooperation. But no doubt climate change has been an important issue for President Obama, and I think he's been happy with the progress made thus far.
Okay, and Professor Nalapat, if India joins, that would be the three largest emitters of the world, China, United States, and India, all committed to this. And if India can join before the inauguration day of a new president coming into the White House, that's going to make sure the current president, President Obama, is going to have this legacy. And secondly, it's also going to make sure, even if the American people elected the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, Mr. Donald Trump, who is not likely to commit to himself to this specific deal, the U.S. could still be in this for 4 years because the rules already set over there. So, will Mr. Modi present a beautiful gift eventually?
Well, I think Prime Minister Modi has changed India's entire approach to climate change by being very constructive rather than basically opposing a lot of these climate agreements. We saw that, for example, in France, where the Indian delegation played a very constructive role. And after Prime Minister Modi came to office 2 years ago, the Indian delegations at these climate conferences have played a very constructive role. Allow me to remind you that India, China, and the United States are going to be very soon the three largest economies of the world.
Right.
And each of them have got a very strongly multiplying relationships with each other. So I don't believe there's going to be any long-term tension between them. Whatever tension is there has been created, in my view, by a certain amount of vested interest from outside the three countries who are trying to instigate one or the other country against the other two. I think it's very important for India, China, and the United States to work together. I think you've got a very wise leadership in President Xi Jinping.
Right.
And certainly from the United States side, I don't believe Donald Trump is going to make a difference. I think he's going to understand the practicality. So
Okay.
in my view, I see growing cooperation. We have seen that between the US and China, and now India is coming in the mix precisely because India is also
right.
growing, and India is going to become part of the trinity of the top three countries.